Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video, we will be covering how all relevant training variables can be manipulated to maximize muscle growth. The first variable we will explore is proximity to failure. Proximity to failure refers to how close a set is taken to the point at which the trainee can't perform any more reps with strict form. Proximity to failure is usually quantified using the rate of perceived exertion, or reps in reserve scale. These scales use a rating to subjectively assess how many more reps could have been performed before complete failure. An RPE of 10 means that no more reps could have been performed in that set, which is also equivalent to 0 reps in reserve. An RPE of 9 means that one more rep could have been performed before failure, which is equivalent to 1 rep in reserve, and so on. To understand how close to failure we should train for muscle growth, we first need to understand the size principle of motor unit recruitment. In each muscle, we have a range of different muscle fibers. Some are smaller and weaker, while some are larger and stronger. The smaller, weaker fibers can be called low threshold muscle fibers, while the bigger, stronger ones can be called high threshold muscle fibers. Essentially, when we perform resistance training, the low threshold muscle fibers are recruited first, and the high threshold fibers are only recruited once they are needed. For example, when we perform a set of any given resistance training exercise, only the low threshold muscle fibers are recruited for the first few reps. Once these fibers fatigue and can no longer lift the weight alone, then the higher threshold muscle fibers are recruited to assist. So the closer to failure the set is taken, the more muscle fibers are recruited. Training to complete failure will ensure that all muscle fibers are trained with each set, regardless of the load used. However, training to failure may also have some negative effects. Training to failure can cause excessive fatigue from both a local and systemic perspective. From a local perspective, training to failure may fatigue a muscle group and limit the quality of training that will be performed in that same session. For example, if the first set of a bench press is taken to failure, the following sets may be reduced in quality, and the following chest, tricep, and shoulder exercises will also be affected in that session. From a systemic standpoint, excessive training to failure may limit overall recovery ability. This means that the total volume of each muscle group over the week may have to be reduced. Training to complete failure too frequently may also contribute to other negative training effects. This study showed that excessive training to failure could potentially increase the risk of overtraining and psychological burnout. So a practical recommendation would be that only a small portion of a trainee's total sets should actually be taken to failure. These sets should be at the end of the session to not reduce the quality of the rest of the training session. Training to failure should mainly be performed in isolation exercises rather than compound lifts to avoid excessive systemic fatigue. When lifting in low rep ranges with heavier loads, more muscle fibers are recruited from the start of the set. When lifting in higher rep ranges with lighter loads, only the low threshold muscle fibers are recruited initially. This research review recommends that training with 6 to 12 rep max loads don't need to be taken as close to failure to maximize hypertrophy. On the other hand, lighter loads should be taken closer to failure to recruit and exhaust the highest threshold muscle fibers. So as a practical recommendation, the majority of training in the 6 to 12 rep range should be taken to around a 2 to 4 reps in reserve, and the majority of training using greater than 12 reps should be taken to around 1 to 3 reps in reserve. The next variable we will explore is what rep ranges are optimal for muscle growth. The rep ranges used will also determine what loads are used and vice versa. This is because there is an inverse relationship between load used and how many reps are able to be performed. In other words, lighter loads allow higher rep ranges to be used, while heavier loads only allow lower rep ranges to be used. As we have already discussed, motor unit recruitment follows the size principle, where low threshold muscle fibers are recruited first and high threshold muscle fibers are recruited last. We also established that heavier loads involve more fibers from the start of the set, while lighter loads only exhaust the high threshold motor units by the end of the set. With this being said, a large spectrum of rep ranges can be used for hypertrophy training, since all rep ranges will eventually train all muscle fibers if taken to a close proximity to failure. This meta-analysis showed that hypertrophy can be equally achieved using a spectrum of different loads, provided that sets were taken very close to failure. So now that we know hypertrophy can be achieved using a large range of rep ranges and loads, is it possible for loads to be too light or too heavy for optimal hypertrophy gains? This study showed that training with loads of 20% 1RM were not as effective for muscle growth as heavier loads. The subjects who used loads of 20% 1RM performed around 60 to 70 reps per set on average, making it very impractical to perform anyway. If loads are too heavy, hypertrophy adaptations may also not be ideal. This is because very low rep ranges may not provide enough total mechanical tension and metabolic stress to fully exhaust the muscles being trained. A practical guideline would be to make the majority of hypertrophy training fall somewhere in the 6 to 20 rep range using challenging loads. Another thought when selecting loads and rep ranges is to consider joint health. Heavier loads generally tax the joints to a more significant degree, meaning that high volumes of heavy loads may cause joint irritation over time. So it is important to make sure that the trainee uses rep ranges that don't cause joint pain over time. The next variable to discuss is volume. Let's now explore how much volume is best for hypertrophy training. Firstly, we need to understand how volume can be quantified. For hypertrophy training, volume is best calculated using the number of sets per muscle group trained per week. This is because hypertrophy can be achieved across a spectrum of different loads and rep ranges. So one set is essentially equivalent to another set for the same muscle group. Volume seems to be the most influential factor driving muscle hypertrophy. This meta-analysis demonstrated that a dose-response relationship between how much weekly volume was performed and muscle growth. In other words, the more volume that was trained with, the more muscle growth that was seen. However, this analysis compared studies using more than 10 sets per muscle group versus less than 10 sets. This isn't a very high level of volume for most trainees, so it makes it difficult to say that more volume is always better. So how much volume is ideal for hypertrophy? This is a difficult question to answer, as there is mixed results in the research and many differences seen in practice among successful trainees. This study found best hypertrophy outcomes using volumes of up to 45 weekly sets for some muscle groups over an 8-week period, while this study found that training with 5 to 10 sets per week was superior to training with 15 to 20 sets over a 24-week period. It seems that high volumes may be more effective in the short term, but may exceed recovery capacity in the long term. This research review suggests that 10 plus sets per muscle group per week is a good average starting point to train with, and then volume can be adjusted over time based on the individual response. The paper also suggests that it may be a good idea to periodize volume over time to avoid exceeding recovery capacity. For example, a muscle group may start with 10 sets per week and build up to 20 sets per week over several months. Next, let's discuss training frequency for muscle growth. Frequency for hypertrophy training refers to how many times per week a muscle group is trained. Training frequency doesn't actually have a significant influence on muscle growth, as it is simply a way of distributing total weekly volume. So frequency is just a method of splitting up the total weekly volume over a certain amount of sessions. As long as total volume is equated, the number of times per week the muscle group is trained doesn't matter to any significant degree. This meta-analysis found that training a muscle group between 1 and 3 days per week had no significant impact on muscle growth when weekly volume was equated. However, from a practical perspective, it should be understood that lower frequencies mean more volume should be used per session, and higher frequencies mean that less volume should be used per session. So individuals can probably choose a weekly frequency based on personal preference. So we understand that if volume is equated, frequency doesn't really matter. However, increasing frequency is a good strategy to increase total volume. Specific muscle groups may be trained more frequently to accumulate more volume than if they were trained less frequently. Another consideration for training frequency is that different muscles may respond best to different frequencies. Smaller muscle groups can generally be trained with higher frequencies than larger muscle groups, since they likely don't induce as much muscle damage and soreness as larger muscles. Additionally, muscles that are able to be loaded in a highly stretched position generally experience more damage and soreness and anecdotally take longer to recover. For example, the chest often experiences high levels of soreness after doing flies through a full range of motion, or the hamstrings after doing full range stiff leg deadlifts. Let's now discuss exercise selection for muscle hypertrophy. Exercise selection refers to what exercises are used to train each muscle group. The exact exercises chosen to train a particular muscle group doesn't have a significant influence on muscle growth. This is because the goal of the exercise is to simply stress the muscle, which can be achieved with a wide range of different exercises for the same muscle group. However, we do want to ensure that the exercise we use does actually stress the muscles we are targeting. A common consideration for exercise selection is to compare compound lifts to isolation lifts for muscle growth. As long as total volume is equated, it probably doesn't make much of a difference if compound or isolation lifts are used. The primary benefit that compound lifts have is that they train multiple muscles simultaneously. This means that a lower total number of exercises can be performed to achieve the same volume. Compound lifts also train muscles that may be neglected if only isolation lifts are used, such as the rear delts, abs, and spinal erectors, which are generally indirectly involved in many compound lifts. Isolation lifts allow 100% of the tension to be placed on a specific muscle. This gives a greater training effect to some muscle groups that may not be fully exhausted using compound lifts. For example, the biceps are trained using rowing exercises, but aren't trained anywhere near close to failure. Isolation lifts are also a good way to increase volume for certain muscle groups with very little additional systemic fatigue. However, using too many isolation exercises means that more total exercises need to be performed to achieve the same volume. This may be practically very inconvenient if too many isolation lifts are used. A practical guideline would be to train using primarily compound lifts and use isolation lifts to get more volume for muscle groups that may not have been fully exhausted from the compound exercises. Another consideration when selecting exercises is range of motion. Limiting range of motion generally means that heavier loads can be used and the joints are loaded to a greater extent. However, does limiting range of motion actually limit muscle growth? This meta-analysis showed that the lower body seems to benefit more from full range of motion exercises, while there was no significant findings for the upper body. As a practical guideline, it seems logical to always use full range of motion to avoid unnecessarily loading the joints and connective tissue. The only reason not to use full range of motion is if a certain range causes joint discomfort. To build on this idea, the last consideration for exercise selection is joint health. Most trainees find specific exercises irritating on some joints, which may be due to individual anatomy or injury history. However, as we have established, many different exercises can be effective for hypertrophy. Therefore, it seems logical to simply avoid exercises which cause pain or discomfort and instead select exercises which feel safe. Next, we'll explore how exercises should be structured in a training session. This refers to what order the exercises are placed in an individual session. The first factor regarding exercise order is compound versus isolation lifts. This meta-analysis showed that there was no difference in muscle hypertrophy whether compound lifts or isolation lifts were performed first in a session for an individual muscle group. Therefore, it probably doesn't matter if compound or isolation lifts are performed first if volume is equated. Let's now explore how order of exercise training different muscle groups influences hypertrophy when multiple muscles are trained in the same session. This research review concluded that hypertrophy adaptations are greater in muscle groups which are trained first in a session. So the muscles that want to be emphasized in a particular session should be performed earlier in the training session. And the last training variable we will cover in this video is the influence of interset rest on hypertrophy. Interset rest refers to how much time a trainee rests between sets of an exercise. Shorter and longer rest periods have distinct advantages and limitations. Shorter rest periods reduce recovery ability, meaning that the following set will have a more significant drop in performance. Shorter rest periods also result in greater metabolic stress, which has been proposed as a primary mechanism of hypertrophy. This is because there is less time to clear the accumulated metabolites in the muscles being trained. Shorter rest periods also allow a higher total number of sets to be performed in the same amount of time. Longer rest intervals give the trainee more recovery, allowing a higher quality of performance in each following set. However, this takes more time to complete a given number of sets, which may be practically inconvenient. This systematic review suggests that longer rest periods of greater than at least 1 minute may be slightly more favorable for hypertrophy adaptations, as they allow more high quality work to be performed with each set. However, this is under the condition that sets are equated. Since shorter rest periods can accomplish a higher number of sets in the same time frame, this may make up for the lack of quality. As a practical guideline, trainees should probably rest as long as they need until they feel ready to perform the next set with good quality. However, from a time efficiency standpoint, excessive rest periods may make training sessions longer than they need to be. Exercise selection also influences how much interset rest should be taken. Generally, heavier compound lifts are more centrally taxing and require longer rest periods to recover, while lighter isolation lifts don't need as long to regenerate. If not enough rest is taken between sets of certain compound lifts, the targeted muscles may not become the limiting factor. For example, if short rest periods are taken between sets of back squats, then cardiovascular fitness may limit performance, or the trunk muscles may fatigue before the legs. Therefore, we aren't fully exhausting the leg muscles with each set. As a practical guideline, longer rest periods of around 2 to 5 minutes should be allowed for compound lifts, while shorter rest periods of around 1 to 3 minutes may be adequate for most isolation exercises. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Remember to subscribe if you haven't already.